Projections are that someday in the future, artificial intelligence will be able to do a lot of our design work for us. Let's take a look at an alternative technique for modeling this part. The kind of technique that AI will have to develop on its own in order to present us with different ways of modeling or a component. So I'm going to drag the playhead for the timeline back to the beginning and make the first sketch visible. And I see that I have a wedge shape here, and let's edit that sketch. And we see that the base is 100, and this dimension is a function. It'll turn out to be a function of this dimension at an angle of 12. So let's look at how we would do that. So I'm going to start a new sketch, and I'll do it on the left side plane. And so I'll start a sketch, and I'm going to draw a line from the origin. I always constrain my geometry to the origin under most cases. There may be some rare cases when we don't. That I'm going to come over a distance of 100. I'll type in that distance, and Fusion automatically puts a horizontal constraint on that line. Notice the line is black. Notice that there's a red lock symbol indicating that the sketch is fully defined. I recommend that beginners create one rectangle or one line or one circle or one polygon, some geometry, and dimension it immediately for a sense of scale for the rest of the geometry. I'm then going to draw a vertical line coming up, and I'll come over at an angle, and then I'll come down here at an angle like that. Note that these curves are blue. They're not fully defined. So I'll begin to define those. Notice there's a perpendicular constraint between this line, so it's vertical, because this line is horizontal. So we could either do perpendicular or a vertical constraint on that. Fusion automatically put the perpendicular on. I'm going to dimension from the origin. So almost all of my dimensions come from the origin. It's our datum, our single source of reference. And so I'm going to dimension from here to here. And let's say I want to do that as a dimension of 30. And then I'm going to dimension this line, and I want it to make a function of that line. So I'm going to select that dimension. It puts the variable name in for that dimension. In this case, it happens to be D2 because that's the second dimension we created. And I'm going to do divided by 3. Now, in some cases, you may end up with a situation where the line is actually on the wrong side of this horizontal line. Simply undo that and drag it up a little higher before you put your dimension in. I'll put in my angle dimension between here and here, and I'll dimension that as 12. Notice all the geometry turns black, and our red lock symbol over here indicating the sketch is fully constrained. So that finishes our first sketch. Save the file. You can see how somebody designed a component by going back into history and stepping through the history step by step to reverse engineer what they did. So in the first step was creating the sketch that we just created. The second step was to create that extrusion. If I right click on this extrusion and I edit feature, I see that it was extruded symmetrically a distance of 35. So we'll go ahead and do that step. So I'll go to my new sketch in my new file, and I like to rotate around where I can see this better. I'm going to do extrude. Now our origin is right there. Let me turn on the visibility of that origin. So there's our origin. We tie everything to the origin, and whenever possible, we use symmetry, whatever symmetry exists in the object, about the origin. So I'm going to come over here and I'll tell it symmetry, and then I want to go to total distance or whole length. If I do a half length, it'll double whatever distance I put in. I'm going to do a whole length, and let's do that as 35. So it goes on either side of this plane in the middle, the YZ plane, and making use of that symmetry makes all of our design work a lot easier. If later on we want to move the object in manufacturing environment, we can easily move any point on the object to wherever we want in the manufacturing environment. I'll say OK to that, and so we see our start of our solid body. If I come over here, I see it says solid body 1. I'm going to go to the top view, and actually let's go back to the reverse engineer file that we were looking at, and we'll go to the top view of that. I'll drag my playhead in the timeline one more step, and I see that there was a chamfer put on here, and so let's hide that previous sketch. We're done with that, and I'll edit this chamfer or edit feature, and I see that it was distance and angle 15 millimeters by 25 degrees. So I'll rotate around so that I can see this, and I'll just select this edge, or you can come up here and find the chamfer. I'll just select the edge, right click, and I'll do chamfer, and I'll set it to go distance and angle from the drop down, and I want to go 15 if I remember correctly, and 20, I forget whether it was 20 or 25 degrees. Let's try 25 degrees. And we'll say OK to that. And if we want to change that angle, we can just edit that feature and change it to whatever dimensions that we want. Okay, if I reverse engineer to the next step, I see that some fillets were put on here, and I'll edit this feature and see what those fillets were. So there were some 3 millimeter fillets, these smaller fillets, and then a 45 millimeter fillet here. Now, it's always a question whether these should be done separately since they're different sizes, or together. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and do those together, but 3 and 45. So let's go to our part, and I'm going to do a fillet. Now I want to select all 4 edges of this face. The easy way to do that is just select the face itself, and then I'll do the same thing here. I'll select this face. So be careful whether you're selecting edges or faces. To continue on, let's go ahead and put in that 3 radius, and I'll add another fillet. Now, because I put in that number, I'm going to have to hold down the control key to get this edge, and I'll select that edge, and I'm going to intentionally miss that edge, so I won't do it. And I'll hold down the control key. I'll get this edge, and I'll get this edge, and I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. So I missed the edge back here. Let's rotate around and look at that. So I missed that edge. No problem. We'll just edit that feature, and I'll hold down the control key while I'm selecting this for this fillet, and I'll say OK to that, and now I have that edge selected that I missed. Now maybe I want this fillet right here to be larger, so I'm going to edit that feature, and I'll hold down I'm going to click plus to add a different radius. So I'll click the plus symbol, and I'll select this edge, and I'm going to put in 45 for that radius. Okay, so that rounds that off a little bit more. Now, if you weren't sure what size you want, you can look at this from a different angle, from the side angle, and just drag it and try to determine what size you want visually for that fillet. We'll say OK to that, and so we've completed those fillets on the tops and the side. We selected the faces and the edges, and again, be careful what you're selecting, whether your intention is a face or an edge to add that fillet. Now, as we continue along, we'll go back and look at the original prototype, and we'll see that the next step was to create this sketch number 2. I'll edit that sketch, and I'm going to look at that either from the top view or from the bottom view. And let's look at it from the bottom because it might be more obvious what we have here. So here's a line going across here, a line going across here, and a center line going across there. And we could either look at it from this orientation or from this orientation. If we use the width of our screen to its maximum width, we can see more of our geometry zoomed in like this. So let's go ahead and create that. So it's 90 from the origin. So again, we use our origin as a datum for our dimensions. 90 from the origin, radius 35, 55 wide. So I'm going to go to my new part, and let's go and rotate around to the bottom. Now we can do the sketch on this face of the part, or we can do the sketch on the work plane. Whenever possible, always use the work planes. The work planes cannot be deleted, and so your sketch isn't going to go sick or have some kind of issues. For the most robust technique is to use the origin planes, not this part face, because we could make a change that causes this part face to disappear. So I'll do my new sketch on this face. I'm going to do a 2-point rectangle, and I'll put it out here in space to start with. Now I said whenever possible use symmetry about the origin, so I'm going to do a midpoint constraint between this line right here and the origin. And we see that this line turns black. It put that at the origin. I'm then going to dimension the distance from here to here, and I forget what that was. It was 95 or 100. Let's put in 100. I think so it was actually shorter than that. Let's do 95. And we can always go back and check what our dimension was. Now, in the original, it's actually 90, so we need to remember to change that. In the original, this point comes to here, and it comes out at an angle about this center line. And actually, I see that this dimension is actually constrained to this point right here. Now, I probably wouldn't do that. I put it at the origin. You'd have to make a decision on the design intent how you want to do that. It will be slightly different results because we did that. I'm going to put in a line from the midpoint right here to the midpoint, and this is the key right here, as I select the midpoint of this vertical line, and I'll change this to a center line, right click and change it to center line, although I don't really need to. You can also toggle it to a center line over here. And then I'm going to delete these two horizontal constraints. So we use a simple 2-point rectangle to put in all these lines rather than sketch them one at a time. But now look what happens. Because we did symmetry, if I drag it on one side, it'll do the same thing on the other side. Let's go ahead and put this in as 55. And I think we decided this would be 90. And then actually, the original was down to here, and I decided to do it from this point. So maybe let's go back to that 95. We'll make some changes to the original design. But let's drag this point now. So we see that it goes the same distance. So we can do this without any mirror. So I would almost never use mirror in a sketch, very rarely. Never use the midpoint or the symmetry constraint, which is actually same as mirror, if you don't have to. Very rarely you'll run into trouble using the mirror constraints because it's computationally expensive, especially if you have a lot of geometry. In this case, we only have 2 lines, but there are better ways than using mirror in a sketch. I'll do coincident, and I'm going to make this point right here coincident to the edge of the part. And we see now that it turns black. Now I was expecting this side also to turn black, so I'll drag it, and when I drag it, I see that this line doesn't stay horizontal as I expected it to for our line of symmetry, and so I'll put a horizontal constraint on this line, and now everything turns black, and we have a red lock symbol over here indicating the sketch is fully defined. I'm then going to create a 3-point arc. So I'll do an arc, 3-point arc, and I'm going to go from this point to this point, and I'll come out to, say, about there. And let's go ahead and put a dimension. Notice right now that curve is blue. Blue geometry should keep you awake at night. Dimension it immediately so that it turns black and is fully defined and you don't run into a problem later on. Now, we could leave this line as an object line, but then we'd have to select both this area and this area. Let's right click on this line and change this to construction. Now we don't have to do that, but it's something that we might want to do. I'm going to rotate around to we can see what we have so far, and then I'll finish this sketch. I'll do extrude, and I'm going to select inside that area. Actually, it was already selected. I just unselected it. Okay, so now it's selected. and I'll drag this up, and I want to go a distance of, say, 2 millimeters, and I want it to join that to the previous geometry. So we'll do join so that those two are joined together. And so we'll rotate around, and we see our solid body. So if I go back to my original, and I'll go ahead and finish that sketch, and I'll go to the next step. So that is the extrude that we just did. And the next step is to do a shell, or make this uniform wall thickness throughout. And when you mold a part, generally you want it to be a uniform thickness. If you have thick and thin areas, the thicker areas will give you something called a sink, or an area where the material shrinks. It's all going to shrink after it cools off, but if it's a thicker area, it'll shrink more than a thinner area. So ideally, it's all the same thickness. And let's see what that shell thickness is. So I'm going to edit that feature, and it happens to be 2 millimeters. Now, our extrusion here is 2 millimeters. If this shell thickness was different than 2 millimeters, we might do it differently than the way that I'm going to do it. But it's the same, so we'll go ahead and do that shell. So I'm going to turn the part over, and I'll do shell, and I'll select this, and I'm going to tell it that thickness is 2 millimeters, and we'll say OK to that, and we'll see then how it gives our part a uniform thickness. Now, just to show how we might have done this differently, if I change that extrusion to 3 millimeters instead of 2 millimeters, notice that there's a ridge along here, a 1 millimeter ridge along here that might not be part of our design intent, so we'd have to use a different technique. I'm going to undo that because I've got it the way I want. Everything is 2 millimeters, and that completes my shell feature. So we'll save the part and continue on. We'll go back to our original prototype and take it to the next step, and we see that some fillets were put on here along this edge and this edge right here. Let's see what the fillet size was. So I'm going to right click and edit that feature, and so I see that it's 1 millimeter, and that's actually these 3 edges along the top, and 5 millimeters in the corner. Again, I might separate that into 2 different features, but we'll go ahead and put it in as one feature. And so I'm going to do a fillet, and I will select this edge. Again, be careful now about selecting faces. If I select this face, it's going to get this edge too, which we may or may not want. But I'm going to select just this edge, and notice we can select the edges right through the object. We don't have to rotate around to see it. I'm going to put in a radius of 1 for that edge, and then I'll click the plus symbol to add another fillet. I'm going to select this edge, and I'll select that edge over here, and I'll put in that as a radius of 5. And so we have those fillets in. Again, you always have to ask a question whether you want to put those 2 different sizes of fillets into one feature or whether they should be 2 separate features. Fillets can be a really problematic area in how you put them in and the order that you put them in. So just try different orders of operations to see the results that you get. Let's examine the original prototype, and we'll drag our playhead to the next step, and we see the sketch number 3. Let's edit that sketch 3. And for sketch 3, we see that it is a line. Let's turn off the solid body. Maybe we can see this better. So it's just a line from the origin, a vertical line, 10 millimeters from the origin, 95 millimeters long. Let's start with it as 90, and then we'll change it as we go along. So I'm going to go to my new part, and I'll go to the top view, and let's turn off this body so that we can see this better. And I'll start a new sketch. I always start my sketches, if possible, on the origin planes, not on a part face. And I'll draw a line, and I'll just put it out here in space somewhere to begin with. And then Notice it's blue with white dots. Blue curves and white dots keep us awake at night. So I'm going to do coincident. I want this line to be coincident with the origin. So notice it turns black. So now it's lined up vertically with the origin, but we still need to dimension the location. So I'll dimension the location from the origin. The origin is my datum, my single source of truth. And I'll dimension again this line from here to here. And I'll do that as 90. Okay. And so I have created that line as was done in the prototype, and we'll finish that sketch, and on the timeline we'll go to the next step, and I'm going to rotate this around, and I see that this separate symbol here, if I right click on that and I edit that feature, notice that symbol, the color of it. I'm going to edit feature, and it doesn't really tell us here, but that color indicates that it's a surface body and it is extruded through all. So I'll go to my file, my new file, and let's rotate around, and I'm going to go to the surface tool. So I'll finish sketch, and I'll leave the solid tools, and I'll go to the surface tools, and I'll do extrude, and I'm going to select this line, and I want it to go all the way through the solid object, so I need to turn that on so I can see it. And for the distance, I'll tell it go through all. And so it's going to go to the top of this solid body, and then it's going to stop. So I'll say OK to that. And we turn off the solid body. So there is our surface body. Our surface body is infinitely thin. It has no thickness. It has no volume. It wouldn't print out if we were going to do a 3D print of this. So we're going to use that then in a special way. So let's turn the solid body back on, and we'll go to our original model, and we'll drag this to the next step, and we'll right click and we'll edit this feature, and we see that this next feature, actually it'd be nice if it would tell you what the feature type was here in the edit box. That's kind of something that they should address in Fusion. But I know from experience in the symbol that this is a pipe, and actually if I put my mouse over it and let it hover there for a minute, I see that it's called a pipe feature. And let's edit that again, and we'll see some more information about that pipe feature. So it says it's circular, and section is 2 millimeters. Join. The distance 1 means that it goes along the whole length of that. If we put like 0.5, it would go half the length, and so forth. And then turn off this chain selection. And we'll see why here when we do it. So let's go to our model, and I'm going to go to the solid tools, and I'm going to do a pipe, and it asks me to select a path. Now if I go to select this path and I have chain select turned on, it's going to go around the entire surface body that we created. I don't want to do that. I don't want to come down here, so I'm going to turn off chain selection. I want it to be circular, and I'll select this part of the path, but because I also want it to come down here, I'll have to select this part of the path as well. Now I'm curious if we had brought this down further, which we're going to do, whether it will automatically get that part of the path or not. We'll find that out in a minute. For the section size, let's leave that on 2 millimeters, and we want to join that together. So let's say OK to that. All right, then I'm going to make that sketch 3 visible. So I'll show that sketch, and actually I want to show the dimensions too. So I'll right click and I'll do show dimensions. And we have this 90. Now actually this curve is wrapping around this curve. Let's increase that, say, to 95. And so we see that it comes down here a little bit further. Let's say we want to go to 100. Now we want to keep it within this area right here. We don't want to go to the edge or off of the edge of the part. Let's try 97.5. And I'll Whoops, I try that again. 97.5. Okay, so that brings it down to here. Now I'm curious of whether the pipe is going to come on down here when we update that. So we'll rotate around, and I see that the curve is coming down here, but the pipe hasn't followed that curve as we extended the length of it. Let's try a modify compute all. And again, it doesn't follow that. So we have to edit that feature, and we'll, in selecting our path, we'll have to select this last little piece that we added to that path. Okay, now that curve follows down there. I'm going to hide that sketch number 3, and I'm going to put some fillets on these ends. We'll go back to the original prototype and we'll check that step. And so I edit that feature, and I see that that radius is 1 millimeter. Keep in mind that the distance from here to here is 2 millimeters, so 1 plus 1 to get across that distance. That's why the radius is 1 millimeter. The diameter is 2. All right, so we'll put a fillet on here, and I'm going to select that edge. I'm going to select this edge, and I'm going to do a radius of 1 millimeter. Let's see what would happen if you put in 2 millimeters. I'm expecting it to give us an error, which it did. So we put in our fillet, and we'll say OK to that. In the prototype, the next thing we did is to make a pattern of those pipes, or I might call them rivets, but in this case, the function in Fusion is a pipe. So we'll go back, and I'm going to do a rectangular pattern, and I have a choice of what I want to pattern: bodies, faces, features, or components. In this case, I want to pattern features. So I'm going to select features, and then the features I want to pattern are the pipe and the fillet on the ends of the pipe. So I'll select both of those features. Then it asks for an axis. Now I could select any one of these lines as an axis, but remember, we could change the geometry in such a way that those lines disappear. So I prefer to select the origin axis, and I can either select it here or I can select the origin axis up here. So use the origin as your datum whenever possible. I'm going to tell it for the distance or direction, I want to go symmetric, so it'll go on either side. If I drag this, you see that it's going to put those on either side. And I'm going to tell it I want an odd number, 7, and I want them to be within this area. And so I'm going to do the distance, let's say 4 millimeters apart. Okay, so I put those 4 millimeters. Let's look at that from the top view. So I know all of that's going to be symmetrical, so I use symmetry about the origin. Now, if I wanted an even number of these pipes, I would put it a certain distance on one side of the origin. I would pattern it one way instead of symmetrically, pattern one way, and then mirror the features to the other side of the origin plane. I've got what I want, and I'll say OK to that. And so we see that we have our pipes on the part. Now let's say that maybe we want to add a fillet onto this edge right here. And maybe I want that fillet to be part of the shell feature. Now let's turn off that surface body so we can see that surface body that we had. Remember, it has no volume, it has no thickness. It will not print out. Let's put that fillet in, but I'm going to drag this shell feature and see if it will give me a failure if I drag it in the timeline. I'm going to drag it all the way down here, and so notice no failure. If you see any yellow or red highlighted issues indicated in the timeline, you've done something wrong. Undo it immediately and figure out what the problem is. Don't just continue working with red or yellow highlighted items in the timeline. I want to do the fillet before that shell feature occurs. So I'm going to drag the timeline somewhere back before the shell feature. So if I rotate this around, I see that it's not shelled. I'm going to put a fillet in here along this edge. Let's say I want to round that off, let's say to 0.5, so that it's not sharp. I'll say OK to that. Now the key is, will the shell pick that up okay without error? So we'll drag that down. It doesn't turn, well, it did turn red, and so we've got an issue. So let's see, sometimes it's as simple as editing that feature and reselect the face. I don't even know if we're going to need to reselect the face. Well, you know where the problem could be is we have these fillets around here. We're trying to shell those as well. So I'm going to undo the steps that I did. Whenever you get that red or yellow, undo and then figure out an alternate technique. So I'm going to drag this back down to here. So the shell was at that location, and then this fillet along this edge, um, and I want to put that fillet in before that edge, and I'm going to put the timeline marker before that fillet, okay, and then I'm going to put the fillet up here that I tried to do before. So I'll do that, and I'm going to do that as 0.5, okay, and it's give me an error in this case. Let's try 1 millimeter. Again, fillets can be real problematic in order to find the right order. And actually, it previewed it, but it didn't put it in the fillet. Let's try 2 millimeters. I'm trying to, so it gives me an error again. Let's do that 1 millimeter. See, it's not putting it in there. So let's undo that fillet. I don't want to put it in here at that point. Okay, so I've undone the fillet. I'll come down here and let's try this again, but it's going in after the shell. I want the shell to occur after the fillet. So I've got the shell after this fillet, and we'll check this again. Everything's okay there. And I'll drag the playhead back before that fillet, and we may or may not be able to get this in. And so let's do the 0.5. I'll say OK to that, and then drag it, see if the shell goes sick. It went sick again. I'm going to try one more thing. I'm going to edit that to a larger size. So I'll edit that to 1 millimeter. I'll say OK to that. And it still gives us an issue. So in order to get that fillet in here, we would have to do something in a different order in order to get the shell feature to not give us an issue. Let's try this rounded shell. And so rounded shell worked okay. So I've changed from sharp shell to a rounded shell, and that solved it okay. Right? And then I'm going to go back and try changing that fillet size to a smaller fillet. So I'll edit that feature. Instead of 1 millimeter, I'll do 0.5 millimeter. And say OK to that. The shell is still okay. It hasn't turned red. I'll drag my playhead to the end. We see that everything is updated okay. And so we can continue on. But again, don't leave red or yellow highlighted items in your timeline. Figure out what the issue is. I'm going to turn off the visibility of my origin, and I want to change this material to rubber. So I'm going to right click, and I have to find a location where we can do this. We'll go to the top of the browser, and notice it says physical material and it says appearance. A lot of people get confused by the difference between physical material and appearance. I can give a part the appearance of gold, but that doesn't make it the the physical material gold. If I made a block of wood appear as gold, but tried to charge you the price for the material gold, you would probably object to that. So be careful between the difference between appearance and physical material. Now, physical material has an appearance, but an appearance doesn't have physical properties. So I'm going to click on physical material, and I'm going to go into the plastic folders, and I'll go on down, and I want to find and see if there's a rubber material in the plastics. And so I'll go down and I see a rubber black. I'm going to go ahead and just drag this rubber up here, and then I'm going to right click and I'm going to say duplicate that material, and I'll right click and edit it, and I'm going to call this rubber comma red. I'll click on the advanced, and then I'm going to go to the appearance. So it has the physical properties of rubber assigned to it. I'll go to the appearance, and I want to change the appearance of that rubber. And so I'm going to click on this Pantone color library, and I'm going to pick a color. Now you can pick whatever color that you want. I'm going to select this fiery red, and we'll say OK to that. And we can change other properties of that. I'll go ahead and do apply to that. And so we just gave a material with properties. We just gave it an appearance. And I'll drag and drop that appearance onto my body, onto the part. Okay. And then we can close out of this. All right, so that was an alternative technique to model this doorstop. Again, at some point in the future, artificial intelligence should show us, say, a dozen or whatever number we indicate we want of different styles or for the model, and then we choose the model that we like the best. I don't think we're quite there yet. So after we edited the shell feature to do it as a rounded shell, it turns out that we can move the shell feature to the end of the history, and everything works okay without failure. Let's see if I can get it to go down here. So now I'll look at the bottom of the part, and we see that even the ribs are shelled. Now that might not be an ideal situation, depending on how we're going to manufacture this. We would have to look at how we do the tooling for the core and the cavity mold.